6 months ago, I reached out to a contact at Hasselblad and proposed an idea. As many of you know, I've been working on a long-term photo project documenting rural decay and rural landscape in America's Southwest, and my tool of choice for exterior architecture and landscape in those settings has been medium format, specifically the X1D2. As many of you know, I absolutely love the form factor of the X1D2, but even more than that, its resolution, micro contrast, its dynamic range, and above all, the extraordinary color rendering straight out of camera that lends itself in utter perfection to the desertscapes of the American Southwest. But in researching the Hasselblad X series lenses, I noticed a big problem. There are not enough YouTube reviews of this series of lenses. So my proposal to Hasselblad was for them to send me all 10 of the current X system lenses, 2 or 3 at a time over the summer, and let me create a comprehensive lens guide. And they agreed. So finally, after months of work and definitely one of the longest and hardest YouTube projects I've undertaken, complicated by pandemics and one of the hottest summers on record, I present to you my Hasselblad XCD lens guide. For those looking to discover which Hasselblad X lens or lenses will be the best to get you started, of course, this video will be a great place to start. But even for those who don't shoot Hasselblad, I really hope that you'll find this entertaining, as I will be sharing with you some of what I consider to be my best rural decay and rural landscape work to date. I want to start with a couple themes or overarching conclusions that I was able to derive from the experience first, as I think will help to characterize what's to come as we get more specific. After that, I'll show you the breakdown comparisons of a few factors, and then we'll get to the good part where I will show you samples or some of the imagery that I've got, and we'll talk about some interesting quirks of each of the lenses. Finally, if you manage to stick it out to the end, I will give you my personal take on which of the lenses I would start out with if I were just getting into the system. So let's talk themes first. And the biggest takeaway for me is that the Hasselblad X series lenses are incredibly consistent. In my career, I've shot mostly Canon and Fuji, and I've found both great and not so great lenses in both systems. I've noticed huge differences in color rendering, sharpness, contrast, consistency, performance, construction, design, even between, like, say, the L series glass or with Fuji's higher end lenses. But what struck me here as I made my way through the Hasselblad lenses is that they are remarkably consistent. I didn't find the color shifting that I've seen with virtually every other system. The colors were consistent. And of course, the design of these lenses are consistent. While not my favorite aesthetic approach to lens design personally, I prefer kind of an older school look and feel. But one thing you can say about the Hasselblad X lenses is that they all look like they belong together. And when it comes to sharpness, I admit to you that I'm fairly new to medium format, but I'm used to seeing 35mm and APS-C formats, and I see a lot of softness with those lenses wide open usually, sharpening up around 2.8 or f4, and then very sharp stop down until the apertures of f22 or diffraction sets in and things soften up. But with the X system lenses, I notice that they are incredibly sharp, wide open, and only just a bit softer at the corners wide open. Than when stopping down. They sharpen up much sooner than smaller format systems that I'm used to. But by the same token, they seem to suffer from diffraction sooner also. I found that at f22 or even f16, they were much softer than I expected them to be. This made me hesitant to shoot at apertures higher than f11 or f16, and for landscape work, I would expect to focus stack as a landscape photographer more than you probably would need to with smaller format systems, at least if you work with a lot of foreground interest. Another consistency that surprised me was how well chromatic aberration was controlled with these lenses. While in some cases you get slight hints of purple or in the foreground or green in the background, I didn't find a single lens where I'd say that it was a problem or anything that would distract the eye, as you often find in other lens series with at least 1 or 2 lenses. The other thing I noticed about the X series lenses is that none of the lenses had rounded aperture blades and also had fewer amount of aperture blades than we're coming to expect from more modern, say, Sony E-mount lenses, for instance. There seems to be this trend in the bokeh-obsessed consumerism over the past 5-8 years that has placed an inordinate weight on bokeh as the it's the most important photographic element. But the X system of lenses appears to not be following this trends with their optical design. Whether that's because the rounded blades and more of the blades would interfere with the leaf shutter design, or if Hasselblad, like me, thinks this bokeh trend is slightly overrated, I'm not sure. But you will see more prominent octagonal light points stop down with these lenses than you will probably with other systems. And in a couple places, you even see it wide open, but we'll come back to that. But those are some of the themes or patterns that I've noticed. Let's now go through a few side-by-side comparisons before we get into more detail into the lenses in specific and get to the best part, which is, I think, the image samples, or at least the part that I'm most excited to share with you. First, though, we should probably compare price. While the image quality and the build quality of these lenses does seem very consistent, as I mentioned, price certainly is not. Clearly, you're paying for glass here as the price goes up proportionally with the number and size of elements. And no surprise, looking at the weight comparison chart, it is nearly identical for the same reason. The notable exception being that 65mm 2.8, which oddly weighs a lot more than the 90 and the 21 and the 30mm lenses, which are priced higher. The next comparison I want to look at is magnification ratio. Where I personally care very little about bokeh quality, I do place a high priority on close focus and magnification ratio. And I think it's a subject a lot of lens reviewers kind of gloss over, unfortunately. So here's a side-by-side of the magnification ratios of these lenses. This will show you how close you can focus and how large the subject will be vis-a-vis the sensor at the minimum focus distance. Of course, we see that 120 3.5 macro lens takes the cake for its 1:2 magnification ratio. But the three that follow, the 45p, the 65-2.8, and that 135-2.8 are no slouches here either. But we do see that those wider angle lenses struggle a bit more when it comes to magnification ratio. When it comes to filter diameter, if you require filters, you can see you'll be investing in mostly two sizes, 67mm and 77mm. Only the 45p at that 62mm filter thread is the black sheep when it comes to filter sizes. So those are some side-by-sides. Now let's get to the best part. I want to go through each lens and show you samples. We'll start with the X System's only zoom lens, the one I have here. Then we'll work our way from the wide end to the telephoto end. The 35-75 f3.5-4 zoom lens has an effective full frame equivalent focal length of 28-59mm, which is actually a fairly limiting focal length when compared to standard focal lengths of other brands' zoom lenses. But if you need a single lens packing some wide to short tele power, this is a no-brainer if you can afford that $5,175 US price tag, that is. With 15 elements in 13 groups, it's no surprise that this is also the heaviest X System lens. This lens zooms internally, which is very nice, and that means that this lens will stay zoomed in where you put it, regardless of how much walking around you do with the lens moving it around. It's not gonna fall out of focus or out of the focal length you set it at. And the focus and zoom do feel nice and smooth. As far as sharpness, this lens rates very high for a zoom lens on the wide end. At the wide zoom and the wide apertures, it is sufficiently sharp at the centers and corners. It gets very sharp at 5.6 and stays that way until f16. I did notice, however, that this lens starts to lose contrast at about f11. Unfortunately, when zoomed in, it does suffer a bit from lower contrast and softness everywhere but f6.8 to f11. It appears that this lens will give you its best sharpness when it is zoomed out. I mentioned that for the most part, chromatic aberration was controlled very well with the X System lenses, and I don't think it's too bad here. Also, you can see a bit of green in the fringes. And as far as bokeh quality, I would call it slightly more nervous of a bokeh here. In practical use, I wasn't bothered by the weight of this lens, even not using a strap and even walking around for several hours. Partly that's because of the wonderful grip that the X1D2 provides. For the type of rural landscape photography that I do though, this lens was really almost perfect. I do wish it would extend a bit further in both directions. I personally really love the 24mm full frame equivalent and the 70mm full frame equivalent focal lengths, and this lens doesn't quite get there in either extreme. Still, I recognize the engineering challenges it would be to go wider, and as far as, you know, a first foray into zoom for this system, this is a really superb lens. At the ultra wide end, we have the 21mm f4, which has a 17mm full frame equivalency. It has 13 elements in 9 groups with 2 aspherical elements. The out of focus quality suffers certainly because of not being able to get close to the subject, but I also noticed that even wide open there is a little bit more stopping down with those octagonal bokeh balls at those points of lights. Aside from that, I also noticed that the bokeh rendering is not so smooth. Definitely this isn't what you get this lens for though. Where you would want a lens like this to perform well though is for more architectural and landscape work probably. In my test it ranked extremely high at the mid apertures, both in the center and the corners. It was at f16 that I noticed a reduction in softness and less contrast, where I'd normally hope that it would keep it together at narrower apertures. Those factors aside, it controls the distortion very well, and I did have a lot of fun with this lens. I was thoroughly impressed with the amount of detail and micro contrast it collected with these race photos. And getting in close with some of these rural decay shots, I just loved it, though I do wish that I could focus just a little closer at times. At the 24mm equivalent focal length, we next have the 30mm 3.5 wide-angle lens. Being that this is one of my favorite focal lengths, I was eager to test this lens out particularly. This lens has 11 elements in 10 groups, one of which is aspherical. It's also one of the few lenses which has external focus movement, which I prefer not to see in a lens when it can be helped. It's also the only XCD lens which tapers out, which probably matters not at all, but I thought it would be worth mentioning. When compared to the 21mm f4 lens, I saw much more sharpness here at the center. Corners though, it performed about the same. When it comes to the out of focus areas, I do have some of the same complaints I did with the 24 f4. It just doesn't allow for close enough focus to maximize that shallow depth of field. But we do see that things are much more smooth here and certainly less nervous. This was probably my favorite lens to use from a documentary photography standpoint. With that focal length, it gave me more forgiveness for not being able to shoot as quickly with the X1D2 as other cameras I'm used to, and it was nice to know that I could crop in if I needed to. For my rural landscapes, it was excellent and also would be my first choice for when I need to shoot wide. At the 35mm equivalent focal length, we have the 45mm 3.5 lens next, not to be confused with the new 45P, which we will talk about in a minute. This is the older, heavier, and more expensive 45mm lens. It has 9 elements in 7 groups and an external focus. As far as sharpness goes, I thought this lens was interesting as it did feel maybe slightly softer than some other lenses at the center, but it held together better at the corners than many of the other lenses, so it was more consistent across the sensor and across the apertures. Still, not the sharpest lens of the bunch, at least not in my tests. In out of focus areas, we do see a hint of green at the edges of things, but the bokeh is soft and pleasant. As far as my experience shooting with this lens, it was fine. I don't particularly love the 35mm equivalent focal lengths myself, but if that were the focal length I needed and wanted the most consistency and sharpness as possible, this would probably be the lens that I would go with. Next up, we have the little brother of the 45 3.5. This is the 45P, which has an f4 aperture. Like the 45 3.5, this also has 9 elements in 7 groups. However, 2 of these elements are aspherical. This lens is much stouter and is also 100 grams lighter than the 45 3.5. This lens actually seems sharper in the very center than the 45 3.5, and for that reason, if you do food or portraits where the subject is usually towards the center, this might actually be preferred than larger, more expensive 45 3.5. But the corners aren't anything to write home about, so for landscape and architecture, you might be better off with the older brother. 2 other things to note about this lens. Unlike others in this series, it has a mechanical focus rather than a focus by wire situation, which I find very intriguing, and it also has the softest shutter. So for documentary or street photographers, this is probably going to be the lens of choice. For me personally, though I know that this lens performs slightly worse when it comes to sharpness to its older brother, in lab tests anyway, I enjoyed shooting with it more for the nice feel of the focus control and its smaller size. And let's not forget that this lens focuses much more closely than the 45 3.5 does. At the 50mm full frame equivalent, we have the 65mm 2.8 lens. This really is the perfect all-around shooter. It has 10 elements in 6 groups. It focuses extremely close, and while it also has an external focus, which again is not my favorite thing, it's one of the sharpest lenses in the X system that I tested. When it comes to the out of focus region, we do see that things don't quite round out at the wide open apertures, so you get that slight octagonal shape at the points of light. But aside from that, bokeh is soft and creamy. Although I ended up shooting with this lens the least, on hindsight, it might be one of my favorites. It's the perfect all-rounder of the X series lenses, and if you're only gonna get one lens, it might be a good one. The 80mm 1.9 with its 63mm full frame equivalent focal length was my favorite portrait lens of the bunch and has the fastest aperture of all the lenses. Though you will certainly pay for that, this lens has 14 elements in 9 groups and is incredibly sharp, even wide open, and stays that way until f/22. Though I messed up and didn't quite get these bokeh tests wide open, even here at f/3.2 you do get a sense of how well it can handle the out of focus bits. And while I didn't explicitly test the autofocus speeds, the 80mm 1.9 to me felt like it might have had the fastest autofocus than any other lens I tried. And it's the one I went to take a lot of my documentary style shots of my family around the house for that reason, but also because of the focal length and the shallow depth of field. In the rural landscape work I do, there were times I appreciated the shallow depth of field a lot also, but I loved that when stopped down, the photos had that wonderful squared up compression I crave, and combined with that rich micro contrast and sharpness that this lens does so well. At an equivalent focal length of 71mm, the 90mm 3.2 also represents an excellent portrait or short telephoto lens. This lens has 10 elements in 8 groups. Unfortunately, it's not able to hang with the 80-1.9 as far as sharpness, except at the mid apertures in the very center. But when you consider all apertures and corners from my testing, I'd probably put this lens in the bottom rung. Though, as I've said before, these lenses are all fairly consistent with each other and the differences are very small. As far as bokeh, this is one area this lens has received some criticism. You can see those octagonal bokeh shapes even wide open, as Hasselblad has restricted it from truly shooting wide open by default, which I understand is to reduce the amount of rogue light bouncing around inside the lens wide open. Though I understand that you can override this setting, that's not something I personally tried. While I did enjoy shooting with this lens a lot, I couldn't help but compare it to the 80mm 1.9, which felt more responsive and was nice to be able to utilize for those shallower depth of field situations and lower light. But at $1,500 cheaper, I wouldn't hesitate to use this lens for portrait and landscape if springing for that 80-1.9 became a little out of reach. While there isn't a true macro lens in the Hasselblad lineup with a 1:1 or beyond ratio, the 120mm 3.5 or 95mm full frame equivalent does have a 1:2 macro capability. This lens has 10 elements in 7 groups. It's incredibly sharp wide open, even fairly sharp wide open in the corners, and is about on par with the other lenses in the series at the higher apertures. The out of focus rendering, while not the smoothest of the X series, is fairly smooth. Like most of the other lenses, I had a lot of fun with this lens, taking advantage of that telephoto range and the extreme compression it can provide. If I have one regret, it's that I didn't take more macro photos with this lens while it was in my possession. The couple I did get, while nothing special, do begin to show the capability of this lens. Finally, we have the 135 2.8 lens with its 105mm equivalent focal length. This lens can also be purchased with the 1.7 times converter, making it really the only lens that provides anything close to sports or action capability. Though I personally did not try out the converter, and I'm not sure that this is the system you get if you want to take action shots or wildlife anyway. This lens has 10 elements in 6 groups. I would rate this lens as middle of the pack as far as sharpness, neither much sharper than other lenses at the center nor softer than others in the corners. In the out of focus regions, I do notice some onion skinning in points of light, but otherwise the fall off is very nice and the bokeh quality is nice and creamy. Though focusing on the X1D2 is not what I would call fast at all, I did end up doing plenty of pre-focusing at given distances and was able to take a few action shots with this lens, and I really loved the results. The compression and the look you can get with medium format system at these focal lengths is really unique and worth the effort to capture. But this lens is also excellent for tight portraits and of course landscapes where you want to isolate details and shoot extremely tight. So there you have it, a brief overview or primer into every single Hasselblad X system lens that we have so far. So what's the bottom line? Which one should you get? Well, that's a hard question to answer without knowing you and the way that you shoot, but I can tell you what I would do, and maybe that might help. If you're on more of a budget, you probably aren't shooting Hasselblad at all. But if you're like me and you know you like Hasselblad specifically for the type of artistic look that it will bring your work, and you're scraping together your dollar bills to make it work, I have no hesitancy whatsoever recommending to you the 45P. I love the way that lens performs, and at just over $1,000 US, that's not a bad price for a medium format lens, all things considered. If you just want one lens, but you don't have a budget, you're not as strict with your funds, of course the zoom lens is a no-brainer. But for me, if it's my money, and if I had a lot more of it than I do have now, there are 3 lenses that I would have my eye on. Again, the 45P, even if it weren't the most affordable of the lenses. I love that that lens has a mechanical focus, as I do end up manual focusing on the X1D2 quite a bit, especially in family situations where I just don't want to rely on that slow autofocus. And also it has that close focus ability that I like. Add to that the price and the quiet leaf shutter and the small form factor, and that lens would be probably my first purchase without a doubt. And with all the money that lens saved me, my second purchase would be a no-brainer also. It would be that spectacular 80mm 1.9 between the shallow depth of field, which can really come in handy in a low light situation or in isolating subjects occasionally, and also that stunning optical perfection that it demonstrates. This lens isn't just one of my favorite X series lenses, it's also now become one of my top favorite lenses of all time in any system. Finally, I'd probably get that 30mm 3.5, although I just wish that it could focus a little bit closer. But that's all I've got for you today, friends. I really hope you found this lens guide useful, and if not that, at least entertaining. Remember to do good with your medium format lenses, and we will talk to you again real soon.